In the dusty town of Millbrook, Texas, everyone whispered the same warning: don't marry Cassandra Whitmore, she's cursed. 3 engagements had ended in tragedy. 3 men had walked away broken, bankrupt, or worse. But ranch owner Jake Sullivan didn't believe in curses, he believed in love. 7 days after their wedding, he held a lottery ticket worth $47 million. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how the most feared woman in Texas became the luckiest bride in America. The trouble with Cassandra Whitmore began long before she ever walked down an aisle. Born during the worst thunderstorm in Millbrook County's recorded history, she entered the world as lightning split the century-old oak tree outside the hospital. The nurses called it an omen. Her mother called it coincidence. The town called it the beginning of something dark. Growing up, Cassandra was everything a small Texas town both admired and feared. Beautiful in a way that made people stop mid-conversation. On Main Street, smart enough to graduate valedictorian, despite missing half her senior year caring for her dying father. Kind enough to volunteer at the animal shelter every weekend, nursing abandoned dogs back to health, yet somehow disaster seemed to follow her like a shadow. The Henderson farm burned down the week after she started working their summer harvest. The Riverside Diner closed permanently just 3 months after hiring her as a waitress. Mrs. Patterson's prized rose garden withered and died the season Cassandra helped tend it. Each time, the town's whispers grew louder. Each time, Cassandra pretended not to hear them. By the time she turned 25, Cassandra had learned to keep her distance. She worked remotely as a freelance graphic designer, rarely venturing into town except for necessities. She lived alone in her late father's modest house on Elm Street, with only her rescue cat, Midnight, for company. The isolation hurt, but it hurt less than watching people cross the street to avoid her, or seeing mothers pull their children closer when she passed. Then came her first engagement. Marcus Chen was new to Millbrook, a young lawyer who'd moved from Dallas to open a small practice. He rented the office space above Murphy's Hardware and hung his shingle with optimism that only an outsider could possess. When he met Cassandra at the post office on a rainy Tuesday morning, he saw only a stunning woman struggling with an armload of packages. He didn't see the other customers backing away or hear their sharp intake of breath when he offered to help. Their courtship was swift and intense. Marcus had never met anyone like Cassandra, intelligent, creative, with a laugh that could light up the darkest room. She spoke 3 languages, could discuss everything from quantum physics to Renaissance poetry, and made the most incredible homemade pasta he'd ever tasted. For 6 months, Marcus thought he'd found paradise in this small Texas town. The warnings started immediately. Old-timers at Buck's Tavern would corner him after his second beer, speaking in hushed tones about the Whitmore curse. Shop owners would shake their heads sadly when they saw him and Cassandra together. Even the Methodist preacher, Reverend Williams, pulled him aside after Sunday service to suggest he pray on his decision carefully. Marcus dismissed it all as small-town superstition. He'd grown up in a city where the only curses people worried about were traffic jams and bad Wi-Fi. He proposed on Christmas Eve, presenting Cassandra with his grandmother's engagement ring beneath the twinkling lights of the town square's ancient pine tree. She said yes through tears of joy, and for a brief moment, even the watching townspeople seemed to smile. The accidents began 3 days later. Marcus's law practice, which had been growing steadily, suddenly hemorrhaged clients. Longtime residents who'd promised him their business found excuses to take their legal matters elsewhere. His biggest case, a land dispute that should have been straightforward, became a nightmare of complications and delays. The opposing counsel, seemed to anticipate his every move, as if someone was feeding them information. Then came the break-in. Thieves targeted his office on New Year's Eve, stealing his computer, client files, and the small safe containing his emergency cash reserves. The police investigation went nowhere. Security footage from the hardware store below mysteriously malfunctioned that night. Within weeks, Marcus was struggling to pay rent on both his office and the small apartment he'd been saving to upgrade before the wedding. The financial pressure mounted. His car broke down, requiring expensive repairs. His health insurance company found a technicality to deny coverage for a minor procedure. The wedding venue, which had been booked and paid for months in advance, suddenly claimed they'd never received his deposit. Each setback felt like a deliberate assault on his future with Cassandra. Marcus tried to weather the storm, but the stress began affecting his health. He developed insomnia, then migraines that left him unable to work for days at a time. His remaining clients grew impatient with delays and cancellations. By March, he was 3 months behind on rent and facing eviction. The final blow came on a sunny Thursday morning. Marcus received a call from his former law firm in Dallas. The senior partner who'd mentored him, the man who'd encouraged him to venture out on his own, had been arrested for embezzlement. The firm was under investigation, and anyone who'd worked there in the past 5 years was being scrutinized. Marcus's law license was suspended pending a full review of his finances and client relationships. That evening, he sat in Cassandra's living room, his head in his hands. The engagement ring sat on the coffee table between them, catching the last rays of sunlight through the window. They both knew what had to happen, but neither wanted to. "Say the words. It's not you," Marcus whispered, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "I just can't. I need to figure out my life first." Cassandra took the ring without argument. She'd been expecting this moment since Christmas, watching the light fade from Marcus's eyes as each disaster compounded the last. She'd tried to convince herself that this time would be different, that love might finally triumph over whatever dark force seemed to follow her. But deep down, she'd been preparing for goodbye since the day they met. Marcus left Millbrook the next morning, his car packed. With the few possessions he hadn't sold to pay debts, he never spoke publicly about what happened, but word travels fast in a small town. The curse had claimed its first victim. Cassandra retreated further into isolation, but loneliness has a way of making people vulnerable to hope. 2 years later, she met David Porter at the county library. He was a history teacher at the high school, recently divorced and new to the area. Unlike Marcus, David had grown up in small towns. He understood the power of local legends and the way communities could turn mythology into reality through sheer collective belief. David approached their relationship like a research project. He interviewed elderly residents about the supposed hearsay, traced its origins through local newspaper archives, and even consulted with a folklorist at the nearby university. His conclusion was that Cassandra had become a scapegoat for the town's anxieties, a convenient explanation for random misfortunes that had been retroactively attributed to her presence. Armed with this rational analysis, David felt confident he could break the cycle. He was methodical in his courtship, documenting each interaction to prove that good things happened around Cassandra just as often as bad ones. He noted that she'd helped Mrs. Garcia's grandson with his college applications, leading to a full scholarship. He recorded that the community garden flourished after she donated heirloom seeds from her father's collection. He compiled evidence that the so-called curse was nothing more than confirmation bias and selective memory. For 18 months, David's scientific approach seemed to work. His teaching career progressed smoothly, earning him tenure and recognition. And from the school district, he and Cassandra became the town's cautious success story, proof that love and logic could overcome superstition. They set a wedding date for the following June and began planning a modest ceremony at the small chapel outside town. The curse, it seemed, was waiting. 3 weeks before the wedding, David's world began to unravel with surgical precision. The school district announced budget cuts that would eliminate his position. His ex-wife, who'd been cooperative about custody arrangements for 2 years, suddenly filed for full custody of their daughter, citing his unstable lifestyle and poor judgment in romantic partners. The house he'd been buying was condemned after inspectors discovered structural damage that had somehow been missed in previous evaluations. But it was the discovery in his classroom that ended everything. During a routine inspection, administrators found inappropriate materials on his school computer, images and files that David swore he'd never seen before. The investigation was swift and thorough. Digital forensics revealed the materials had been accessed during hours when David was documented as being in the building. His password had been used. His fingerprints were on the keyboard. David lost his job, his reputation, and his chance at custody in a single devastating week. The criminal charges were eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the damage was complete. No school district would hire him, no parent would trust him. His name became synonymous with scandal in a community that thrived on gossip and moral certainty. The night before their wedding, David sat across from Cassandra in the same chair where Marcus had surrendered his ring 2 years earlier. This time, there were no tears, no dramatic declarations, just the quiet acceptance of 2 people who'd tried to outsmart fate and lost. "I documented everything," David said, his voice hollow. "I had spreadsheets, graphs, statistical analyses. I thought I could prove them wrong." Cassandra nodded. She'd watched him work, seen his careful notes and methodical approach. Part of her had believed in his confidence, had dared to hope that education and evidence might triumph over superstition. But another part had been counting down to this moment from their first kiss. "Maybe they're right," she whispered. "Maybe I am cursed." David left Millbrook that night, taking a teaching position in a distant state where no one knew his name or his story. The wedding flowers were donated to the hospital. The reception hall stood empty, except for the ghosts of another failed dream. By now, the pattern was established in local law. Cassandra Whitmore was untouchable, a beautiful disaster waiting to happen to anyone foolish enough to love her. Parents used her story to warn their sons about the dangers of ignoring community. Wisdom. Young men who showed interest in her found themselves on the receiving end of serious conversations with fathers, uncles, and family friends. The third engagement came 3 years later, and it was the most painful of all. Thomas Reeves owned the town's only bookstore, a cozy space that smelled of coffee and old paper, where Cassandra had spent countless hours since childhood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was 42, never married, content with his quiet life surrounded by stories and the regular customers who'd become his extended family. He'd watched Cassandra grow up, had seen her weather the storms of local prejudice with grace that most people never recognized. Unlike her previous suitors, Thomas knew exactly what he was walking into. He'd witnessed both broken engagements, had heard every whispered warning and dire prediction. His decision to pursue Cassandra wasn't born of ignorance or scientific skepticism. It was born of love that had developed slowly over years of shared conversations about books, life, and dreams deferred. "I know what they say," he told her the night he proposed, his hands shaking as he held the simple silver ring. "I know what happened to Marcus and David, but I also know you, Cassandra. I've known you since you were 12 years old. Checking out every mystery novel in my children's section, I've watched you be kind to people who whisper about you behind your back. I've seen you rescue animals, help neighbors, and bring light into dark places. If that's a curse, then I want to be accursed. For 6 months it seemed like Thomas might be the exception. His bookstore thrived as never before. A travel magazine featured it in an article about charming small-town destinations, bringing tourists and online orders that transformed his modest business into a regional success. He and Cassandra planned a small ceremony in the bookstore itself, surrounded by the stories that had brought them together. The end came swiftly and brutally. Fire consumed the bookstore on a windless Tuesday night in October. Investigators found evidence of arson, but the perpetrator was never identified. 20,000 books turned to ash, along with Thomas's life savings, insurance records, and 30 years of carefully cultivated relationships with publishers and distributors. The building was a total loss, and the insurance company found enough irregularities in Thomas's policy to deny most of his claim. But losing the bookstore was only the beginning. Within days of the fire, Thomas learned that his elderly mother had fallen victim to a sophisticated financial scam, losing her retirement savings and the family home to con artists who seemed to know intimate details about her life and vulnerabilities. His brother's marriage imploded after the discovery of an affair that had been ongoing for months. His best friend's teenage son was arrested for drug possession, facing charges that would derail his college prospects. Every pillar of Thomas's carefully constructed life crumbled simultaneously, as if some malevolent force had identified his deepest connections and systematically destroyed them. The man who had built his existence around community and relationships found himself isolated, broke, and surrounded by the wreckage of other people's lives that he somehow felt responsible for destroying. The night he returned Cassandra's ring, Thomas looked older than his 42 years. The fire had left him with a persistent cough and eyes that seemed to have lost their capacity for joy. He sat in her living room, the same space where 2 other men had surrendered their dreams, and spoke in the measured tones of someone who'd been broken but not defeated. "I don't regret loving you," he said, and meant it. "I don't regret proposing or planning a life together, or believing we could overcome whatever forces work against you. But I can't ask other people to pay the price for my happiness. My mother, my brother Danny's kid, they didn't choose this. They're collateral damage in a war I can't win." Thomas left Millbrook the following week, relocating to help care for his mother and piece together what remained of his family's shattered lives. The empty lot where his bookstore had stood became a parking area, then a small park with a bench that no one ever seemed to use. 3 engagements, 3 disasters. 3 good men driven from town by forces that seemed to defy explanation or resistance. By her 30th birthday, Cassandra Whitmore had become Millbrook's most famous resident and its most isolated citizen. Children dared each other to walk past her house on Halloween. Teenagers made up elaborate stories about her supposed supernatural powers. Adults spoke of her with a mixture of pity and fear that made normal relationships impossible. Cassandra stopped trying to fight the narrative. She stopped explaining coincidences or defending herself against whispered accusations. She accepted the role the town had assigned her, the cursed woman, the cautionary tale, the living reminder that some people were meant to walk through life alone. She focused on her work, building a successful graphic design business that allowed her to support herself without depending on local clients or contacts. She volunteered for causes that didn't require face-to-face interaction, donating anonymously to charity, supporting environmental groups online, contributing to disaster relief funds for communities she'd never visit. She found ways to be useful without being visible, to make a positive impact while maintaining the isolation that seemed to protect others from whatever dark influence surrounded her. The years passed quietly. Cassandra's house became a landmark of sorts, the place where the cursed woman lived, pointed out to visitors as part of Millbrook's unofficial ghost tour. She was 34 when Jake Sullivan moved to town, and by then, her story had calcified into local legend. Everyone knew about Cassandra Whitmore. Everyone knew to stay away. Everyone except the stubborn rancher who was about to change everything. Jake Sullivan arrived in Millbrook on a Tuesday in March, driving a dust-covered pickup truck that had seen better decades. He pulled into Murphy's gas station with the windows down, country music drifting from the radio, completely oblivious to the stares his arrival was generating. The truck bed was loaded with ranch equipment, feed sacks, and a border collie named Ranger who surveyed the town with intelligent eyes. Nobody in Millbrook had been expecting Jake Sullivan. The Henderson Ranch had been on the market for 2 years, its price dropping steadily as potential buyers discovered the challenges of running cattle operations in an area where drought had become the norm rather than the exception. The previous owners had finally accepted defeat after 3 consecutive years of losses, but local real estate agents had assumed the property would eventually be sold to developers or converted into suburban housing. Jake had different plans. At 38, he'd spent 15 years working other people's ranches across Texas, Colorado, and Montana, learning every aspect of cattle management, land restoration, and sustainable agriculture. He'd saved every penny, lived in bunkhouses and trailer parks, and dreamed of the day he could put his own name on a deed. The Henderson Ranch wasn't pretty. Drought had turned most of the pastures brown, the fencing needed complete replacement, and the main house hadn't been updated since the 1970s. But it was his. The first thing people noticed about Jake Sullivan was that he didn't ask questions about local gossip or town politics. When Murphy's regulars tried to fill him in on area history, he nodded politely and steered the conversation back to practical matters: where to buy feed, which veterinarians served the county, how to register his brand with the state. He seemed genuinely uninterested in the social dynamics that dominated small-town life. The second thing people noticed was that he worked. From dawn to dusk, Jake was outside repairing fences, clearing irrigation ditches, and rebuilding infrastructure that had been neglected for years. His dog Ranger became a familiar sight, trotting alongside the ranch truck as Jake made his rounds. Within a month, the Henderson place was starting to look like a working ranch again. Jake's approach to ranching was different from what Millbrook was used to. Instead of fighting the dry conditions, he embraced drought-resistant native grasses and implemented rotational grazing patterns that allowed pastures to recover between use. He installed solar panels to power water pumps and built a rainwater collection system that could sustain his operation through extended dry periods. The old-timers at Buck's Tavern watched his progress with skeptical interest, waiting for the inevitable failure that claimed most newcomers. It was during his 3rd week in town that Jake first encountered Cassandra Whitmore. He'd driven into town for supplies, parking his truck outside Fletcher's Hardware while Ranger waited in the shade. The afternoon was unseasonably warm for March, and Main Street was busier than usual, with people emerging from winter hibernation to enjoy the weather. Jake was loading fence posts into his truck bed when he noticed the woman across the street, struggling with an armload of groceries and art supplies. She was beautiful in a way that made him pause mid-motion, her dark hair catching the sunlight as she tried to balance packages while searching for her car keys. But what struck Jake most was the invisible bubble of space around her. People walked past without making eye contact, gave her a wide berth on the sidewalk, and seemed to actively avoid acknowledging her presence. Jake had grown up in small towns, across the rural West. He understood the complex social hierarchies that governed community life, the unspoken rules about who belonged and who didn't. But he'd also learned that those rules often said more about the community's fears than about the people they ostracized. Without thinking, he jogged across the street. "Let me help you with those," he said, reaching for the packages that were sliding from her grip. Cassandra looked up, startled. Men in Millbrook didn't offer to help her with anything. They barely looked at her, and when they did, it was with the kind of wariness reserved for dangerous animals or unstable explosives. This stranger's easy smile and outstretched hands confused her more than they should have. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the response she'd perfected over years of polite rejections. "I'm sure you are," Jake replied, "but these bags don't look fine. They look like they're about to scatter art supplies all over Main Street." He was right. The paper bag, containing her drawing pencils and watercolors, was developing a tear that threatened to dump its contents onto the sidewalk. Cassandra hesitated, then allowed him to take the heavier packages. They walked together toward her car, a compact sedan parked in the shade near the library. "I'm Jake Sullivan," he said as she unlocked her trunk. "Just moved to the Henderson place." Cassandra Whitmore. She waited for the recognition to dawn, for his helpful demeanor to shift into the careful politeness that preceded hasty excuses and quick retreats. Jake nodded and loaded her packages into the trunk with the efficiency of someone accustomed to physical work. "Nice to meet you, Cassandra. You're an artist?" The question caught her off guard. People in Millbrook knew she worked as a graphic designer, but no one had ever shown interest in her personal creative pursuits. The art supplies were for her own projects: watercolor paintings of the countryside around Millbrook, sketches of birds and wildflowers that she worked on in the solitude of her backyard studio. "Just a hobby," she said. "The good kind of hobby, or the kind that makes you wish you had more time." Cassandra found herself almost smiling. "The kind that makes me lose track of time completely." "Those are the best kind," Jake said, closing her trunk. "Well, Cassandra Whitmore, I should let you get on with your day. Thanks for letting me play, gentlemen. My mother would disown me if she heard I let a lady struggle with packages." He tipped an imaginary hat and walked back toward his truck, leaving Cassandra standing by her car with a strange feeling she couldn't identify. It took her several minutes to realize what had happened. Someone had treated her like a normal person. No nervous glances, no hurried conversation, no sense that he was counting the seconds until he could politely escape her presence. That evening, Cassandra found herself thinking about the encounter as she worked on a watercolor painting of the old oak tree in her backyard. Jake Sullivan was either completely ignorant of local politics or genuinely didn't care about them. Both possibilities intrigued her more than they should have. Jake, meanwhile, was learning about Cassandra's reputation in the most direct way possible. The next morning, he was picking up lumber at Fletcher's Hardware when the conversation around him died to an uncomfortable whisper. Ed Fletcher, who'd been friendly and talkative during Jake's previous visits, suddenly became curt and businesslike. "That'll be $147.32, Ed said, avoiding eye contact as he rang up the purchase. "Something wrong, Ed?" Jake asked, genuinely puzzled by the change in atmosphere. The other customers in the store found sudden interest in hammers and paint cans, but Jake caught fragments of whispered conversations, saw him talking to her. "Doesn't know. Should warn him." Ed Fletcher cleared his throat. "Jake, you're new here, so maybe nobody's mentioned. Well, maybe you should be careful about getting too friendly with certain people. Millbrook's a good town, but we look out for each other. That means sometimes we need to share information about situations." Jake loaded his lumber into the truck, thinking about Ed's carefully worded warning. That afternoon, while replacing a section of fence line, he asked his nearest neighbor about the strange encounter at the hardware store. Bill Hawkins owned the spread adjacent to Jake's ranch. He was a weathered man in his 60s who'd lived in Millbrook his entire life and remembered when the Henderson Ranch was the most productive in the county. He'd been cautiously welcoming to Jake, offering advice about local suppliers and sharing information about water rights and grazing regulations. "You're talking about Cassandra Whitmore," Bill said, when Jake described the woman he'd helped with. "Packages. Pretty girl, lives alone on Elm Street. Been engaged 3 times, and every man who tried to marry her ended up wishing he'd never been born." Jake listened as Bill recounted the stories of Marcus, David, and Thomas, 3 men whose lives had been systematically destroyed after becoming involved with Cassandra. Bill's version of events was more detailed than the whispered warnings at the hardware store, filled with specific examples of financial ruin, professional destruction, and personal catastrophe. "Now, I'm not saying I believe in curses," Bill concluded, adjusting his hat against the afternoon sun, "but I've lived here long enough to know that some patterns can't be explained by coincidence. 3 good men, Jake. 3 solid, decent men who had their lives torn apart after they started courting that girl. Make of that what you will." That evening, Jake sat on his porch with Ranger at his feet, watching the sun set over his newly acquired land. The dog's ears perked up at every sound, the distant lowing of cattle, the cry of a hawk circling overhead, the rustle of wind through drought-stressed grass. Jake had always trusted Ranger's instincts about people and situations. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense trouble before it manifested, had warned Jake away from dangerous horses, dishonest employers, and more than one bar fight. Ranger had shown no signs of alarm around Cassandra Whitmore. If anything, the dog had seemed relaxed during their brief encounter, tail wagging as she'd bent down to scratch behind his ears before getting into her car. Jake made a decision that would change everything. The next Saturday, he drove into town with a specific purpose. Instead of heading to his usual stops, the feed store, the bank, the post office, he parked outside the library and walked through the front doors. If Cassandra Whitmore was the dangerous woman everyone claimed, he wanted to judge for himself, based on more than a 5-minute conversation about art supplies. The Millbrook Public Library was a small building that had served the community for nearly a century. Its shelves were crowded with books that ranged from current bestsellers to classics that had been donated by longtime residents. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, no relation to the previous ranch owners, looked up nervously when Jake approached. "The circulation desk. Can I help you find something?" she asked, her voice carrying the same careful tone Jake had encountered at the hardware store. "I'm looking for books about sustainable ranching," he said. "Drought management, native grasses, that sort of thing." Mrs. Henderson relaxed slightly. This was a safe topic, a legitimate request that had nothing to do with local gossip or social complications. She led him to the agriculture section, pulling several books that might be useful for his ranch operation. Jake was browsing through a manual on rotational grazing when he heard a familiar voice from the next aisle over. Cassandra was speaking quietly with someone, her tone patient and encouraging. Curious, he moved closer and discovered her kneeling beside a young boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. "The trick with watercolors," she was saying, "is that you have to let them be wet. Don't try to control them too much. Let the colors flow into each other and see what happens." The boy, who Jake recognized as Tommy Martinez from the family that ran the Mexican restaurant on Main Street, was holding a paintbrush with intense concentration. Spread across the library table were sheets of watercolor paper, some finished, and others in various stages of completion. The paintings were simple but vibrant, flowers, animals, abstract swirls of color that captured the joy of a child discovering art. "Like this?" Tommy asked, touching his brush to the paper and watching blue paint spread into yellow, creating a soft green cloud. "Exactly like that," Cassandra said, smiling with genuine delight. "See how the colors talk to each other? That's the magic part." Jake watched this interaction with growing interest. The woman kneeling on the library floor, patiently teaching a child to paint, bore no resemblance to the dangerous figure described in local warnings. Her movements were gentle, her voice warm, her entire demeanor radiating the kind of nurturing energy that children instinctively recognized and trusted. "Miss Cassandra," Tommy said, "can you teach me how to paint my dog?" "I'd love to," she replied. "What does your dog look like?" Tommy launched into an enthusiastic description of his family's Chihuahua mix, complete with dramatic gestures and sound effects. Cassandra listened with the focused attention usually reserved for much more important conversations, asking questions and offering suggestions for how different techniques could capture the dog's personality on paper. Jake found himself genuinely impressed. Teaching art to children required patience, creativity, and the ability to communicate complex concepts in simple terms. Cassandra possessed all three qualities in abundance, creating a learning environment that was both educational and fun. The painting session lasted another hour. Jake pretended to study his ranching books while observing the interaction between Cassandra and Tommy. Other library patrons gave them a wide berth, but Tommy seemed completely unaware of any social tension. To him, Cassandra was simply the nice lady who taught him about colors and encouraged his artistic experiments. When Tommy's mother arrived to pick him up, the dynamic in the library shifted noticeably. Maria Martinez approached with obvious reluctance, her smile forced as she thanked Cassandra for watching her son. The conversation was brief and formal, lacking the warmth that had characterized Cassandra's interaction with the child. After they left, Cassandra began cleaning up the art supplies with practiced efficiency. Jake watched her carefully rinse brushes and pack away paint tubes, her movements quiet and economical. There was something melancholy in her posture, a resignation that suggested she was accustomed to being tolerated rather than welcomed. Jake made his second life-changing decision in less than a week. "Those are beautiful paintings," he said, approaching the table where Cassandra was gathering the finished artwork. She looked up, startled to find him standing nearby. "Oh, hello, Jake, right? From the ranch?" "That's right. I didn't know you taught art classes." Cassandra's expression became guarded. "I don't, really. Tommy he saw me painting in the park a few weeks ago and asked if I could show him. His mother was running errands, and I offered to keep an eye on him." "Well, you're a natural teacher," Jake said. "That kid was completely absorbed in what you were showing him." Something flickered across Cassandra's face. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude for the compliment. "He's very talented. Children usually are before they start worrying about making mistakes. Sounds like wisdom from experience." "I majored in art education before I switched to graphic design," Cassandra said, then immediately looked as if she regretted sharing that information. Jake filed away this detail. Art education suggested someone who'd planned to work with children, to share creativity and encourage young artists. The switch to graphic design, a more solitary, commercially focused field, might have been driven by practical considerations, but it could also represent a retreat from more social forms of artistic expression. "What made you change majors?" he asked. Cassandra finished packing the art supplies before answering. "It turned out teaching wasn't as practical as I'd hoped." The careful phrasing told Jake everything he needed to know. In a small town where parents whispered warnings about the cursed woman, a career working with children would be impossible. Cassandra had probably discovered that her reputation made her unemployable in traditional educational settings, forcing her to find alternative ways to support herself. "Their loss," Jake said simply. Cassandra looked at him with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. "You don't know me well enough to make that judgment." "Maybe not," he agreed, "but I know enough about teaching to recognize talent when I see it." They walked toward the library exit together, Cassandra carrying her art supplies and Jake holding his stack of ranching books. The afternoon sun was painting Millbrook's Main Street in golden light, and the Saturday evening crowd was beginning to emerge from shops and restaurants. Jake noticed how people's conversations quieted as they passed. how groups of teenagers stopped talking and stared, how mothers instinctively moved closer to their children. The invisible barrier around Cassandra was almost tangible, a force field of community disapproval that followed her wherever she went. At her car, Jake made his third life-changing decision. "Would you maybe like to have dinner sometime?" he asked. Cassandra's hand froze on her car door handle. She turned to look at him with an expression of complete shock, as if he'd just suggested they rob a bank together. "Dinner?" she repeated. "Yeah, you know. Food, conversation, maybe at that Mexican place where Tommy's family works. I hear they make great enchiladas." "Jake," Cassandra said carefully, "I think there are some things about me you should know before you make offers like that." "Such as?" She gestured vaguely at the town around them, at the watching faces and whispered conversations. "I'm not exactly popular in Millbrook. Getting involved with me tends to be complicated." "Complicated how?" Cassandra studied his face, searching for signs of the nervous energy that usually preceded hasty retreats from her presence. Jake looked genuinely curious, as if her warning had only increased his interest rather than deterred it. "Have you talked to anyone about me?" she asked. "Bill Hawkins, Ed Fletcher, anyone who's lived here for more than 5 minutes?" "I've heard some stories," Jake admitted, "about your previous relationships and the problems that followed." "And you still want to have dinner?" Jake considered the question seriously. He thought about Bill Hawkins's warnings, the uncomfortable atmosphere at the hardware store, and the pattern of disasters that had allegedly befallen Cassandra's former fiancés. He also thought about the woman he'd observed teaching art to, a child, the patience and kindness she'd shown, and the way Ranger had immediately trusted her. "Yeah," he said, "I still want to have dinner." Cassandra stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to solve a complex puzzle. Finally, she shook her head with something that might have been amusement. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Jake Sullivan." "Probably both," he agreed. "So what do you say?" "I say yes," Cassandra replied. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Their first date at Martinez family restaurant became the talk of Millbrook before they'd finished their appetizers. News traveled fast in a town where entertainment was scarce and gossip was currency. By the time Jake and Cassandra were sharing a plate of Maria's famous cheese enchiladas, half the town knew that the new rancher was either incredibly brave or spectacularly naive. Jake had chosen the restaurant deliberately. He understood small-town dynamics well enough to know that taking Cassandra somewhere public would send a clear message. He wasn't ashamed to be seen with her, and he had no intention of conducting their relationship in secret. The decision also served a practical purpose. He wanted to observe how the community treated her in a social setting, to see if the warnings he'd received matched the reality of her daily experience. The reality was worse than he'd expected. The Martinez family treated them with professional courtesy, but Jake noticed the subtle signs of discomfort. Maria's smile was forced when she took their order. Their teenage daughter, Rosa, who normally chatted with customers about school and weekend plans, kept her interactions brief and formal. Even Tommy, the boy who'd been so enthusiastic about art lessons at the library, seemed subdued when he helped clear their table. Other diners made their disapproval more obvious. Conversations stopped when Cassandra passed their tables. An elderly couple Jake had met at the feed store actually got up and moved to a different section of the restaurant. The Methodist preacher's wife made a show of gathering her family and leaving after shooting pointed looks in their direction. "This is why I don't date," Cassandra said quietly, cutting her enchilada into smaller pieces she wasn't actually eating. "It's not fair to put people in this position." Jake watched her push food around her plate, noting the practiced way she'd withdrawn into herself. This was clearly a familiar experience. The isolation, the judgment, the weight of an entire community's disapproval focused on her presence. Put people in what position, he asked. The position of having to choose sides, deciding whether being polite to me is worth the gossip and speculation that comes afterward. Seems like a pretty easy choice to me. Basic human decency shouldn't require courage. Cassandra looked up from her plate, studying his face with an expression that suggested she was still trying to figure out whether he was genuine or simply hadn't grasped the situation yet. "You really don't understand what you're walking into, do you?" she said. "Enlighten me." Cassandra set down her fork and leaned back in her chair. For the first time since they'd sat down, she looked directly at him instead of focusing on her, the food or the table. "3 men have tried to build relationships with me," she said. "All 3 had their lives systematically destroyed. Marcus lost his law practice and had to leave town in debt. David lost his teaching career and custody of his daughter. Thomas lost his bookstore, his mother's retirement savings, and nearly everything his family had worked for. The pattern is always the same. Things start well, then cascade into disaster until walking away becomes the only option." "And you think you caused all that?" "I think it doesn't matter what I believe. The results speak for themselves." Jake considered this. He'd heard the stories from Bill Hawkins and others, but hearing them summarized by Cassandra herself added a different dimension. There was no self-pity in her voice, no dramatic claims about supernatural forces or mystical curses. Just a matter-of-fact recitation of events that had shaped her understanding of her place in the world. "What if the pattern isn't about you?" he asked. "What if it's about them?" Cassandra frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if the problem isn't some curse that follows you around, but the way this town treats anyone who gets close to you? What if the disasters happened because the community made them happen?" The suggestion clearly hadn't occurred to her. Cassandra had spent so many years accepting responsibility for the misfortunes that befell her romantic partners that she'd never considered alternative explanations. "That's a pretty elaborate conspiracy theory," she said. "Is it? Small towns can be brutal when they decide someone doesn't belong. I've seen communities systematically exclude people, sabotage their businesses, and make their lives impossible without anyone ever acknowledging what they're doing. It's not supernatural, it's social pressure applied with surgical precision." Jake outlined his theory as they finished their meal. Marcus's law practice had failed because potential clients were discouraged from hiring him. David's career had been destroyed by planted evidence and character assassination. Thomas's bookstore had burned under suspicious circumstances, and his family's subsequent troubles could have been orchestrated by people who knew intimate details about their vulnerabilities. "But why?" Cassandra asked. "Why would an entire town conspire against me?" "Maybe because having a local curse is more interesting than admitting you live in a place where bad things happen for boring reasons. Maybe because blaming you for random misfortunes is easier than dealing with actual problems. Or maybe because some people just need someone to exclude and you drew the short straw." It was a disturbing theory, but it made more sense than supernatural explanations. Cassandra had become Millbrook's scapegoat, the convenient explanation for anything that went wrong in the vicinity of her relationships. The community had invested so much in her cursed reputation that they had a vested interest in maintaining it, even if that meant actively sabotaging anyone who challenged the narrative. They talked until the restaurant began closing around them, exploring the implications of Jake's theory and discussing what it might mean for any relationship they chose to pursue. By the time they walked to their cars, Cassandra had begun to see her history through a different lens, not as evidence of supernatural doom, but as the result of social dynamics that could potentially be understood and countered. "So, what happens now?" she asked as they stood beside her sedan in the restaurant's parking lot. "Now we see if a stubborn rancher is harder to break than a lawyer, a teacher, and a bookstore owner," Jake said. Their courtship unfolded with deliberate intention on Jake's part. Unlike Cassandra's previous suitors, who had either ignored the warnings or tried to prove them wrong through logic and evidence, Jake operated on the assumption that they were facing human opposition rather than supernatural forces. This meant treating their relationship like a strategic campaign rather than a romantic experiment. Jake's first move was to establish himself as a valued member of the community before anyone could attempt to isolate him. He joined the volunteer fire department, contributing both his time and his mechanical skills to maintain aging equipment. When the elementary school needed help repairing playground structures damaged by a spring storm, Jake showed up with tools and lumber. He sponsored a youth baseball team and donated beef to the annual church barbecue fundraiser. These activities served multiple purposes. They demonstrated Jake's commitment to Millbrook's welfare, making it harder for people to portray him as an outsider who didn't understand local values. They also created networks of obligation and goodwill that would make community members think twice before participating in any coordinated campaign against him. Simultaneously, Jake made his ranch operation too successful to ignore or sabotage easily. His innovative drought management techniques began producing results that impressed even skeptical neighbors. His cattle thrived while others struggled with the ongoing dry conditions. His implementation of sustainable grazing practices started attracting attention from agricultural extension agents and university researchers. The ranch's success created a practical problem for anyone inclined to undermine Jake's position in the community. His methods were being studied and adopted by other local ranchers. His expertise was increasingly valuable to neighbors dealing with similar challenges. Destroying Jake Sullivan would mean destroying someone whose knowledge and techniques were benefiting the entire agricultural community. Most importantly, Jake conducted his relationship with Cassandra in full view of the town. They attended the farmers' market together every Saturday morning. They sat together at high school football games. They showed up as a couple to community events, charity fundraisers, and church services. Jake's message was clear. He was proud to be with Cassandra, and he had no intention of hiding their relationship or apologizing for it. This public approach forced the community to confront their treatment of Cassandra directly. It was one thing to whisper warnings to an isolated newcomer, quite another to ostracize a man who'd become integral to local agriculture and volunteer organizations. People who wanted to exclude Cassandra found themselves having to exclude Jake as well, which meant losing access to his expertise, his volunteer work, and his economic contributions. The strategy worked, but not without cost. Jake faced constant pressure to reconsider his choices. Business associates suggested he could do better. Fellow volunteers expressed concern for his welfare. Even Bill Hawkins, who'd become a genuine friend, continued to warn Jake about the pattern of disasters that had befallen previous suitors. "I'm not saying you're wrong to care about her," Bill said during one of their fence line conversations, "but caring and marrying are two different things. Maybe you could just keep things casual?" Jake's response was always the same. He was a grown man capable of making his own decisions, and those decisions weren't subject to community approval. The real test came 6 months into their relationship when Jake proposed. He chose his moment carefully, waiting until after the harvest season when his ranch's success was undeniable and his position in the community was secure. The proposal itself was private, a quiet evening on Cassandra's back porch with only her cat Midnight as a witness. But Jake made sure news of their engagement became public knowledge immediately. The reaction was swift and predictable. Suddenly, Jake found himself the subject of intense scrutiny and unsolicited advice. People who'd welcomed his contributions to community life began questioning his judgment. Some of his newer friendships cooled noticeably. A few business relationships became strained as suppliers and customers expressed concerns about his decision-making. abilities. But this time, the community's response was tempered by Jake's established position and ongoing value to local agriculture. He was too useful to abandon completely, too successful to dismiss as a foolish outsider. The opposition to his engagement was real but muted, expressed through social pressure rather than the systematic destruction that had characterized previous campaigns against Cassandra's suitors. Jake and Cassandra planned a small wedding for the following spring, inviting only a handful of close friends and family members. The ceremony would be held at the small chapel outside town, with a simple reception at Jake's ranch. They kept the guest list deliberately modest, wanting to celebrate their commitment without creating a public spectacle that might inflame community tensions. The months leading up to their wedding were the happiest of Cassandra's adult life. For the first time since high school, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Jake's steadfast support had created space for her to reconnect with parts of herself she'd been forced to suppress. She resumed painting outdoors, setting up her easel in the ranch's pastures to capture the changing light on the hills. She started volunteering again, helping with the library's children's reading program and contributing artwork to school fundraisers. Most remarkably, other people began treating her differently. Jake's acceptance had given community members permission to acknowledge her positive qualities. Parents who'd previously discouraged their children from interacting with her began allowing supervised playdates where she could share art techniques and nature knowledge. Local businesses started commissioning her graphic design services, recognizing the quality of her work now that hiring her no longer carried social stigma. The transformation wasn't complete or universal. Some families continued to view Cassandra with suspicion, and certain community members remained convinced that Jake was making a terrible mistake. But the wall of isolation that had surrounded her for years had developed significant cracks, allowing glimpses of the life she might have lived if circumstances had been different. 3 weeks before their wedding, Jake received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. He was repairing a section of barn roof when his cell phone rang, displaying a number he didn't recognize. The caller identified himself as Robert Kellerman, an attorney from Dallas representing the estate of Jake's great-uncle Walter, a man Jake had met only a handful of times during childhood family gatherings. "I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Walter Sullivan passed away last month," the attorney said. "He's left you something in his will, a lottery ticket he purchased the week before his death. Apparently, he had a tradition of buying tickets with significant family birthdays, and he wanted you to have this particular one." Jake found the gesture touching but hardly significant. Uncle Walter had been known for his eccentric habits and sentimental gestures. The lottery ticket was probably worthless, but it represented a connection to family history that Jake valued more than any potential monetary prize. "I'll drive down to pick it up," Jake said. "Actually, Mr. Sullivan, I should mention that this particular ticket has some unusual characteristics. Your uncle specifically requested that it not be checked until after your wedding. He seemed to believe the timing was important for some reason." Another of Uncle Walter's quirks, Jake thought. The old man had always been superstitious about dates and numbers, convinced that certain combinations held special power. Jake agreed to the attorney's terms, arranging to collect the ticket the week after his wedding. The conversation might have remained a minor footnote in their wedding preparations, except that Cassandra happened to overhear Jake's side of the call. When he explained about the inheritance, she grew quiet in a way that he'd learned to recognize as significant. "A lottery ticket?" she asked. "Yeah, probably worthless. But Uncle Walter was sentimental about family traditions." Cassandra nodded, but Jake could see her mind working through implications he couldn't fathom. That evening, she brought up the subject again as they sat on his porch watching the sunset. "Jake, what if your uncle's lottery ticket actually wins something? Then we'll have a nice surprise to start our marriage." "Why?" "Because if it wins something significant, people are going to say it proves the curse is real." Jake hadn't considered this angle. In the context of Cassandra's history, any major financial windfall following their marriage would be interpreted as evidence that good fortune followed her relationships, at least initially. The community would see it as confirmation of the pattern they'd been warning against, proof that Jake was destined for the same cycle of dramatic success followed by catastrophic failure. "Let them talk," Jake said. "We know the truth about us, and that's what matters." But Cassandra's concerns proved prescient. When they returned from their honeymoon in Colorado the following week, Jake drove to Dallas to collect his uncle's bequest. The lottery ticket was an old-fashioned paper slip, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, along with a handwritten note explaining Uncle Walter's birthday number system. Jake checked the numbers that evening, comparing them against the previous week's drawing results with the casual interest of someone who expected nothing. When the first number matched, he double-checked his reading. When the second and third numbers aligned, he asked Cassandra to verify what he was seeing. By the time they'd confirmed all 6 numbers, they were staring at a lottery ticket worth $47 million. The news broke in Millbrook before they'd finished calling family members to share their incredible fortune. Small towns have efficient communication networks, and Jake's sudden wealth became common knowledge within hours. The reaction was immediate and divided exactly as Cassandra had predicted. Half the community saw the lottery win as proof that Cassandra's curse was finally broken, that love had triumphed over superstition, and that good things happened to good people who made brave choices. The other half viewed it as confirmation of the dangerous pattern they'd been warning against, dramatic good fortune that would inevitably be followed by equally dramatic disaster. $47 million, Bill Hawkins said when he stopped by the ranch the next morning. "That's more money than Marcus, David, and Thomas lost combined." "Meaning what exactly?" Jake asked. "Meaning the bigger they rise, the harder they fall. And brother, you just rose pretty damn high." The lottery win transformed Jake and Cassandra's position in Millbrook overnight. Suddenly, they were the town's most famous residents, their story attracting attention from regional media and curious visitors from neighboring communities. The ranch became a landmark, pointed out to tourists as the place where the cursed bride's luck had finally changed. But fame brought its own complications. Reporters wanted to interview them about the curse, the lottery, and the intersection of luck and love in small-town America. Distant relatives emerged with claims on the fortune. Investment advisors and financial planners descended on Millbrook like hungry vultures, each promising to help the young couple manage their unexpected wealth. Most challenging of all, the lottery win forced Cassandra to confront a question she'd never expected to face. What if the curse was real, but worked in reverse? What if she didn't bring misfortune to the men who loved her, but rather brought extraordinary good fortune that was inevitably followed by proportional disaster? The possibility haunted her as they navigated the early weeks of their marriage and sudden wealth. Every time Jake left the ranch, she wondered if this would be the day the pattern reasserted itself. Every business decision, every investment choice, every seemingly minor event carried the weight of potential catastrophe. Jake tried to reassure her, but privately he was beginning to understand the psychological pressure that had broken her previous relationships. It wasn't supernatural forces that destroyed the men who loved Cassandra Whitmore. It was the constant expectation of disaster, the unbearable tension of waiting for good fortune to transform into its opposite. The real test of their marriage wouldn't be community acceptance or financial security. It would be whether their love could survive the weight of a $47 million question. Was Cassandra truly free of her curse, or had it simply evolved into something more sophisticated and ultimately more destructive? As summer settled over Millbrook and their first month of marriage drew to a close, Jake and Cassandra faced a future that was both more promising and more uncertain than either had dared to imagine. The lottery ticket had changed everything, but whether that change represented salvation or the beginning of their own inevitable tragedy remained to be seen. The curse of Cassandra Whitmore had claimed 3 victims. The question now was whether it would claim a 4th, or whether the stubborn rancher who'd refused to believe in impossible things had finally found a way to break a pattern that had defined a woman's entire adult life. Time would tell. In Millbrook, Texas, it always did. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came 3 weeks after the lottery announcement, when Eleanor Blackwood arrived in Millbrook, driving a silver Mercedes that cost more than most people's houses. Eleanor wasn't from Texas. She wasn't even from the South. She was a cultural anthropologist from Northwestern University who specialized in folklore, superstition, and the social dynamics of small communities. She'd driven 12 hours from Chicago after reading about Cassandra's story in a regional newspaper article that had somehow found its way onto academic social media circles. "I'm writing a book about American folk beliefs and their impact on social structures," she explained to Jake and Cassandra over coffee at the newly reopened Martinez family restaurant. "Your story represents a fascinating intersection of mythology, community psychology, and economic transformation. I'd like to document it properly." Cassandra was immediately suspicious. Years of being treated as a curiosity had made her wary of outsiders who viewed her life as research material. But Eleanor's approach was different from the sensation-seeking reporters who descended on Millbrook in the wake of the lottery story. She was genuinely interested in understanding the social mechanisms that had created and maintained Cassandra's reputation. "What I find most intriguing," Eleanor said, pulling out a notebook filled with meticulous handwriting, "is how your community has maintained this narrative for over a decade, despite a complete lack of evidence for supernatural causation. The disasters that befell your previous fiancés can all be explained through conventional means: social ostracism, coordinated business interference, and targeted harassment campaigns." Jake leaned forward, interested despite himself. "You think the whole curse thing was deliberately manufactured?" "I think it served multiple social functions," Eleanor replied. "It gave your community a sense of uniqueness. How many small towns can claim their own local curse? It provided a convenient explanation for random misfortunes that might otherwise be attributed to economic decline, poor planning, or simple bad luck. Most importantly, it created a clear boundary between acceptable and unacceptable behavior." Eleanor's theory was more sophisticated than the simple conspiracy Jake had imagined. According to her research, the curse narrative had evolved organically from a combination of coincidence, confirmation bias, and community need. Cassandra's early childhood during the storm had provided the initial seed of supernatural association. Her father's death and the subsequent misfortunes of her romantic partners had reinforced the pattern, but the community had actively participated in maintaining and strengthening the narrative because it served their psychological and social needs. "The fascinating part," Eleanor continued, "is how Mr. Sullivan's approach has disrupted the entire system. By refusing to accept the community's narrative and establishing his own independent value structure, he's forced everyone to confront the artificial nature of the boundaries they'd created." The anthropologist spent 6 weeks in Millbrook, conducting interviews with longtime residents, reviewing historical records, and documenting the social changes that had occurred since Jake and Cassandra's marriage. Her findings would eventually form the basis of an acclaimed academic paper, but more immediately, her presence in town forced conversations that had been avoided for years. Eleanor's interviews revealed the extent to which the community had unconsciously collaborated in maintaining Cassandra's isolation. Business owners admitted to discouraging customers from hiring her for graphic design work. Parents acknowledged steering their children away from interactions with her. Even well-meaning residents confessed to treating her with the kind of careful politeness usually reserved for the mentally unstable or potentially dangerous. "The thing is," Martha Henderson told Eleanor during one recorded interview, "we all knew Cassie was a good person. Sweet girl, never caused trouble, always willing to help when someone needed it. But once the story got started about her being cursed, it became easier to just go along with it. Nobody wanted to be the family that got too close and ended up suffering for it." The anthropologist's research also uncovered evidence of more deliberate interference in Cassandra's relationships. Marcus Chen's law practice had failed partly because several prominent families had coordinated to withdraw their business after he proposed. David Porter's professional troubles had been exacerbated by anonymous tips to school administrators about his questionable associations. Thomas Reeves's bookstore fire remained officially unsolved, but Eleanor found witnesses who'd seen suspicious activity in the area that night. Activity involving people who had strong opinions about curse breakers and their inevitable fates. Perhaps most disturbing, Eleanor discovered that the pattern of escalating disasters hadn't been entirely coincidental. Each successive relationship had faced increasingly severe opposition because the community had become more invested in proving the curse was real. Marcus had been allowed to fail through passive non-cooperation. David had faced active sabotage. Thomas had encountered what amounted to organized persecution. By the time Mr. Reeves became involved with Cassandra, Eleanor explained to Jake and Cassandra during one of their final interviews, significant portions of your community had developed a psychological need for the curse to be real. Proving it false would have meant acknowledging their complicity in destroying 3 innocent men's lives. The revelation was devastating for Cassandra. Learning that her supposed curse was largely the product of human malice rather than supernatural forces should have been liberating. Instead, it was crushing. The men she'd loved hadn't been victims of cosmic injustice. They'd been sacrificed to maintain a community's comfortable delusions about itself. At least, if it was really supernatural, there would have been some honor in their suffering, she said to Jake one evening as they sat in their ranch house living room. Eleanor's research. Files spread across the coffee table. This is just evil, petty, deliberate evil dressed up as tradition and community values. Jake tried to comfort her, but privately, he was struggling with his own dark thoughts about the people he'd worked to join and serve. How many of his volunteer fire department colleagues had participated in Thomas Reeves's harassment? Which of his fellow church members had coordinated to destroy David Porter's career? How many of the neighbors who'd welcomed his agricultural expertise had simultaneously been plotting against the woman he loved? The psychological pressure was enormous. Unlike Cassandra's previous suitors, Jake now understood exactly what he was fighting against. Not supernatural forces, but human beings who had demonstrated their willingness to destroy innocent people to maintain their preferred version of reality. The knowledge made every interaction with community members fraught with suspicion and resentment. Eleanor's departure in late summer left Jake and Cassandra with a choice that would define the rest of their lives. They could use their lottery winnings to leave Millbrook entirely, starting fresh in a place where Cassandra's history wouldn't follow them. They could stay and try to rebuild relationships with people who'd participated in a decade-long campaign of psychological terrorism against the woman they claimed to care about. Or they could find a third option that acknowledged the complexity of human nature while protecting their own well-being. The decision was complicated by an unexpected development. Cassandra was pregnant. The pregnancy was discovered during a routine medical appointment in September, 3 months after their wedding and 6 weeks after the lottery win. Dr. Patricia Morales, who delivered half the babies in Millbrook County over the past 20 years, tried to maintain professional neutrality as she delivered the news, but Jake caught her exchanging meaningful glances with her nurse. "Congratulations," Dr. Morales said carefully. "Based on your last menstrual period, I'd estimate you're about 8 weeks along. Everything looks normal so far." Outside the medical office, Jake and Cassandra sat in their truck processing the news and its implications. A baby would make leaving Millbrook more complicated. Cassandra's entire support network, limited as it was, existed here. But staying meant raising a child in a community that had demonstrated its capacity for collective cruelty when it served their psychological needs. "What are people going to say?" Cassandra asked, unconsciously placing her hand over her still flat stomach. "That we're having a baby," Jake said firmly. "That's what normal people say when normal couples get pregnant." But they both knew it wouldn't be that simple. The timing of the pregnancy, coming so soon after the lottery win, would be seen as either proof that Cassandra's curse was finally broken or evidence that the pattern was accelerating toward its inevitable climax. Every aspect of the pregnancy would be scrutinized for signs of supernatural significance. The speculation began immediately. Within days of their announcement, theories were circulating about whether a child born to the formerly cursed bride would inherit supernatural abilities or vulnerabilities. Elderly residents recalled folk beliefs about curse breaking and the spiritual significance of babies conceived during periods of dramatic fortune reversal. Even people who claimed not to believe in such things found themselves unconsciously treating Cassandra's pregnancy as an event of mystical importance. Jake tried to shield Cassandra from the worst of the gossip, but isolation became increasingly difficult as her pregnancy progressed. Every trip to town became an exercise in navigating whispered conversations and pointed stares. Well-meaning neighbors offered advice about prenatal care that came loaded with superstitious warnings about maintaining spiritual protection during vulnerable times. Even medical appointments became fraught with subtle suggestions about seeking additional traditional guidance alongside conventional obstetric care. The stress was affecting Cassandra's health. She developed insomnia that left her exhausted. During the day, her appetite disappeared, requiring careful monitoring to ensure adequate nutrition for the developing baby. Most concerning, she began experiencing anxiety attacks that seemed to come from nowhere, sudden episodes of panic and dread that left her shaking and gasping for breath. Dr. Morales recommended counseling, but finding appropriate mental health services in rural Texas proved challenging. The nearest therapist was 40 miles away in the county seat, and she specialized in addiction recovery rather than anxiety disorders. Jake considered taking Cassandra to specialists in Dallas or Houston, but the logistics of regular travel during pregnancy seemed overwhelming. The solution came from an unexpected source, Eleanor Blackwood. The anthropologist had maintained contact with Jake and Cassandra after leaving Millbrook, partly for professional reasons and partly because she'd genuinely grown to care about their well-being. When Jake called to describe Cassandra's struggles with pregnancy-related anxiety, Eleanor immediately recognized the symptoms of trauma response. "She's not just dealing with normal pregnancy stress," Eleanor explained during a long-distance consultation. "She's processing years of psychological abuse while simultaneously facing community expectations about her child's mystical significance. That's enough to overwhelm anyone's coping mechanisms." Eleanor connected them with Dr. Sarah Chen, a trauma specialist in Austin who worked with clients dealing with community-based persecution and religious trauma. Dr. Chen agreed to provide telephone counseling sessions, supplemented by occasional in-person visits when Jake and Cassandra could travel to Austin for other business. The therapy helped, but slowly. Cassandra had to unlearn decades of self-blame and internalized shame, while simultaneously preparing for motherhood in a community that viewed her child as either prophetically significant or potentially dangerous. The process was exhausting and emotionally draining, made more difficult by the physical demands of pregnancy. Meanwhile, Jake was discovering that sudden wealth brought its own complications. The $47 million required professional management, tax planning, and careful investment strategies. He found himself spending increasing amounts of time on conference calls with financial advisors, lawyers, and accountants, people who understood money but had no comprehension of the social dynamics that made their situation unique. The lottery win had also attracted unwanted attention from beyond Millbrook. Distant relatives emerged with claims on the family fortune. Investment scammers targeted them with sophisticated schemes designed to separate wealthy but inexperienced investors from their money. Media requests continued arriving from reporters who wanted to update the cursed bride story for anniversary articles and human interest features. Most disturbingly, they began receiving letters from people around the country who believed Cassandra possessed supernatural abilities that could be transferred or purchased. Some wanted her to touch lottery tickets or bless business ventures. Others offered to pay significant sums for personal consultations about their own romantic or financial problems. A few suggested that her child would inherit mystical powers that could be cultivated through proper training and spiritual guidance. "We can't live like this," Cassandra said one evening in November, sitting by the fireplace with a pile of increasingly bizarre correspondence spread across her lap. "I can't raise a child in an environment where people think they're some kind of magical creature." Jake agreed, but the solution wasn't obvious. Moving would mean abandoning the ranch that represented his life's work and dreams. Staying meant subjecting their child to the same kind of scrutiny and supernatural speculation that had defined Cassandra's entire adult life. The answer came during a conversation with Bill Hawkins, who stopped by the ranch in early December to discuss winter grazing strategies. Bill had been one of the first people to warn Jake about Cassandra's reputation, but he'd also become a genuine friend who respected Jake's judgment, even when he disagreed with his choices. "You know," Bill said as they watched cattle moving through the winter pasture, "there's something nobody talks about in all this curse business. Cassie's father, Robert Whitmore, was one of the best men this town ever knew. Honest, hard-working, generous to anyone who needed help. If there was any justice in the world, his daughter would have inherited his reputation, instead of getting blamed for every piece of bad luck that crossed her path." The comment sparked an idea that would transform how Jake and Cassandra approached their future in Millbrook. Instead of fighting against the community's narrative about supernatural forces and mystical significance, they would create their own narrative, one that honored Cassandra's actual character and contributions while providing people with a more positive framework for understanding her story. They started by establishing the Robert Whitmore Foundation, using a portion of their lottery winnings to fund scholarships for local students pursuing art education. The foundation also supported community beautification projects, children's literacy programs, and assistance for families dealing with medical emergencies or natural disasters. Cassandra began teaching art classes at the community center, finally, putting her education degree to use in service of local children. Jake expanded his sustainable agriculture demonstrations, hosting workshops that attracted ranchers from across the region. They positioned themselves not as lottery winners who'd gotten lucky, but as community members who wanted to use their resources to honor the best traditions of small-town mutual support. The strategy worked gradually but effectively, As winter turned to spring and Cassandra's pregnancy advanced, the focus of community attention shifted from supernatural speculation to practical appreciation for the positive changes their foundation was bringing to Millbrook. Children who'd learned to paint in Cassandra's classes began displaying their artwork around town. Families who'd received foundation assistance became advocates for the couple's genuine commitment to community welfare. Most importantly, the foundation's work gave people a new way to understand Cassandra's story. Instead of the cursed woman who brought disaster to anyone who loved her, she became the town's most generous benefactor, someone who'd overcome personal tragedy to dedicate herself to helping others. The transformation wasn't complete or universal. Some residents remained convinced that supernatural forces were at work, either for good or ill. Others continued to view the couple with suspicion, convinced that their generosity was somehow calculated or manipulative. But by the time their daughter Emma was born on a warm spring morning in May, Jake and Cassandra had successfully created space for their family to exist as normal community members rather than objects of mystical fascination. Emma arrived healthy and beautiful, without supernatural fanfare or apocalyptic significance, just a baby girl whose parents loved her and whose community was learning to see past old fears toward new possibilities. The curse of Cassandra Whitmore hadn't been broken by lottery winnings or true love or mystical intervention. It had been dismantled through the patient work of building genuine relationships, creating positive change, and refusing to accept other people's definitions of what was possible. Standing in the hospital room with his wife and newborn daughter, Jake realized that they'd accomplished something more valuable than winning the lottery. They'd proven that even the most entrenched community narratives could be changed when people were willing to do the hard work of seeing each other clearly and choosing compassion over fear. The woman who'd once been called the cursed bride was now simply Cassandra Sullivan, wife, mother, teacher, and philanthropist. And that, Jake thought as he watched her cradle their sleeping daughter, was the most powerful magic of all. 5 years after Emma's birth, Millbrook had transformed into something unrecognizable from the town that had once whispered warnings about the cursed bride. The changes were visible everywhere, in the vibrant murals painted by children from Cassandra's art programs, in the thriving downtown businesses that benefited from the agricultural tourism Jake's sustainable ranching demonstrations attracted, and in the confident smiles of young people who'd received Robert Whitmore Foundation scholarships to pursue dreams their families could never have afforded. But the most profound transformation was in the stories people told about themselves. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood returned to Millbrook in the autumn of Emma's 5th year, this time to document the social changes her initial research had helped catalyze. The anthropologist found a community that had developed entirely new narratives about its identity and values, stories that emphasized resilience, generosity, and the power of second chances rather than supernatural curses and inevitable doom. "It's remarkable," Eleanor confided to Jake and Cassandra during dinner at their ranch house, where 5-year-old Emma was showing off her own artistic talents with finger paints and construction paper. Academic literature suggests that entrenched folk beliefs take generations to evolve. You've managed to facilitate fundamental narrative change in less than a decade. The key, Eleanor realized, had been Jake and Cassandra's decision to work with human nature rather than against it. Instead of trying to convince people that their beliefs were wrong, they'd channeled the community's need for meaningful stories into more positive directions. Millbrook still loved having something that made it special, but now that something was the town where love conquered superstition, where a community learned to choose hope over fear, where ordinary people accomplish extraordinary things through persistence and generosity. The foundation had become the centerpiece of this new identity. What had started as a scholarship fund for art students had expanded into a comprehensive community development initiative. The foundation supported small business development, funded infrastructure improvements, and provided emergency assistance for families facing medical or financial crises. It had become the economic engine that allowed Millbrook to thrive while larger communities struggled with declining rural populations and limited opportunities. Cassandra's role had evolved far beyond what anyone could have predicted during her years of isolation. She now served on the school board, coordinated the annual Millbrook Arts Festival, and had become the unofficial liaison between local ranchers and the Agricultural Extension Service. Her expertise in sustainable land management, learned through years of working alongside Jake, was sought after by farming communities across central Texas. Most significantly, she'd become the person parents turned to when their children showed artistic talent or unconventional interests. Families who'd once crossed the street to avoid her now sought her guidance about nurturing creativity and supporting young people who didn't fit traditional molds. The woman who'd been excluded from community life had become its most trusted advisor about inclusion and acceptance. Jake's ranch had evolved into a demonstration site for sustainable agriculture practices that attracted visitors from universities, government agencies, and agricultural organizations around the world. His techniques for drought-resistant grazing and renewable energy integration were being studied and replicated across the American West. The ranch, that had started as one man's dream of independence, had become a laboratory for solutions to some of agriculture's most pressing challenges. But perhaps the most telling change was in how the community talked about the past. The stories about Marcus Chen, David Porter, and Thomas Reeves had been reframed through the lens of collective responsibility and learning. Instead of cautionary tales about supernatural dangers, they became examples of how fear and misunderstanding could lead good people to make harmful choices. The community had acknowledged its role in the suffering of those three men, and several prominent families had made efforts to locate and apologize to them. Marcus had rebuilt his law practice in Arizona and declined contact with anyone from Millbrook, which the community respected. David had found success as a freelance educational consultant and had graciously accepted the town's formal apology, though he had no interest in returning to Texas. Thomas had used his insurance settlement to open a new bookstore in Oregon, and he maintained cordial correspondence with several Millbrook residents who'd reached out to make amends. The evolution of these stories reflected a broader maturation in how the community understood itself. Millbrook had learned to acknowledge its capacity for both cruelty and kindness, to recognize that the same social forces that could destroy lives could also rebuild them when channeled toward positive purposes. Eleanor's follow-up research documented these changes through interviews with longtime residents, many of whom expressed genuine remorse for their past behavior and pride in their community's transformation. But the most powerful testimony came from unexpected sources. The children who'd grown up during Millbrook's transition from a place defined by fear to one characterized by possibility. Mrs. Sullivan taught me that art isn't just about making pretty pictures, said Jessica Martinez, now 16 and the recipient of a foundation scholarship to study graphic design at the University of Texas. It's about seeing things differently and helping other people see them too. She showed me that being different isn't something to be afraid of. It's something to celebrate. Emma Sullivan, now old enough to understand some of her family's history, had become a bridge between the community's past and future. She moved through Millbrook with the confidence of a child who'd never experienced exclusion or supernatural speculation, but she also carried stories about overcoming prejudice and building bridges between different kinds of people. My mom used to be sad because people didn't understand her, Emma explained to Eleanor during one of their conversations. But then she and Daddy decided to help people understand by showing them good things instead of just telling them. Now, everybody knows that our family helps people, and people want to help us too. The wisdom of a 10-year-old had captured something that academic analysis sometimes missed. The transformation of Millbrook hadn't been about proving anyone right or wrong, but about creating new experiences that allowed everyone to be better versions of themselves. However, the success story wasn't without its complications. Sudden wealth and community prominence had brought pressures that Jake and Cassandra were still learning to navigate. The foundation's success had attracted attention from larger philanthropic organizations who wanted to partner on expanded initiatives. Government agencies sought their input on rural development policies. Media outlets periodically revisited their story as an example of how communities could overcome destructive social dynamics. All of this attention was gratifying but exhausting. Jake and Cassandra found themselves traveling frequently for conferences and consultations, often leaving Emma with trusted neighbors or family friends. The ranch required constant attention, and the foundation demanded increasing amounts of administrative work as its programs expanded. The center's impact extended far beyond the families it served directly. Millbrook's residents discovered that supporting children facing life-threatening illnesses brought out the best in their community. The same social dynamics that had once maintained Cassandra's isolation now channeled themselves toward comprehensive care for vulnerable families. Local businesses competed to provide services and support to center families. Churches coordinated prayer networks and practical assistance programs. The school district developed flexible educational accommodations that allowed young patients to continue learning during treatment. Even teenagers found meaningful ways to contribute, from organizing fundraising events to providing companionship. For children their own age who were dealing with medical challenges, the transformation was profound, but different from what had happened 15 years earlier when Jake and Cassandra first challenged the community's narrative about the cursed bride. This time, instead of overcoming destructive beliefs, Millbrook was discovering its capacity for extraordinary compassion and practical love. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood returned for a third research visit, this time to document how the community's evolution had prepared it to embrace its role as a refugee for families in crisis. Her findings revealed something that surprised even Jake and Cassandra. The same social mechanisms that had once maintained harmful exclusion had been redirected toward radical inclusion. What you've accomplished represents a complete inversion of the original social dynamics, Eleanor explained during her presentation to the center's board of directors. The community's need for shared meaning and collective identity now expresses itself through comprehensive care for vulnerable people rather than systematic exclusion of those perceived as different or dangerous. The Pediatric Support Center attracted attention from medical professionals, policy researchers, and family advocacy organizations across the country. But unlike previous recognition of their work, this attention felt sustainable and purposeful rather than intrusive. The center's mission was inherently about service rather than self-promotion, and the community's role was to provide support rather than serve as a research subject. Families who'd been served by the center became its most powerful advocates, sharing stories about how Millbrook had provided not just medical support, but genuine community during their children's treatment. These testimonials attracted additional families, funding partners, and volunteer supporters who wanted to contribute to an approach that addressed the full spectrum of needs that medical crises created. As Emma prepared for college, she reflected on how the center had shaped her understanding of her family's mission and her own future goals. She'd been accepted to study social work at the University of Texas, with plans to specialize in medical social work and family crisis intervention. I used to think our story was about breaking a curse and proving that love could overcome superstition, she told her parents during one of their evening conversations. But working at the center taught me that it was really about learning how to take care of each other properly. Everything else was just practice for this. Emma's insight captured something essential about the journey that had brought them from the cursed bride narrative to their current role as leaders in comprehensive family support. Each phase of their story had built skills and understanding that prepared them for increasingly complex challenges in serving human needs. Cassandra's experience with isolation had taught her to recognize when people felt excluded and help them find pathways back to community connection. Jake's background in sustainable agriculture had prepared him to think systematically about resource management and long-term planning. Their marriage had demonstrated that love required strategic thinking and persistent effort, not just good intentions and romantic feelings. The lottery winnings had provided financial resources, but more importantly, they'd forced Jake and Cassandra to grapple with questions about purpose, responsibility, and how to use unexpected advantages for meaningful goals. The Foundation's work had taught them about philanthropy, community development, and organizational management. The Community Transformation Initiative had expanded their understanding of how social change happened in different contexts and cultures. All of these experiences had prepared them to tackle the comprehensive challenge of supporting families during medical crises, work that required every skill they'd developed and every lesson they'd learned about human nature, community dynamics, and practical problem-solving. The center's 5th anniversary celebration took place on a warm spring evening, with families, community members, medical professionals, and supporters gathering in the renovated downtown area that had become Millbrook's heart. The event featured presentations from families who'd been served by the center, updates on medical partnerships and treatment innovations, and recognition for community members who'd contributed to the center's success. But the most moving moment came when Tommy Martinez, now a professional artist whose work was displayed in galleries across Texas, unveiled a mural he'd created for the center's main entrance. The artwork depicted children and families of all backgrounds moving through a landscape that transformed from darkness to light, fear to hope, isolation to community. Mrs. Sullivan taught me that art could change how people see things, Tommy said as he spoke about the mural's symbolism. This painting is about how Millbrook learned to see families in crisis, not as burdens or tragedies, but as neighbors who needed our help to find their way back to hope. As Jake and Cassandra stood with Emma and the gathered community, watching children who'd survived cancer play with their siblings in the center's garden, they realized they'd discovered something more valuable than breaking any supernatural curse. They'd learned how to build a community that consistently chose love over fear, inclusion over exclusion, and hope over despair. The woman who'd once been known as the cursed bride had become the architect of a refuge where families facing impossible circumstances found not just medical support, but genuine community care that helped them maintain their humanity during the most challenging experiences of their lives. And in that transformation, Jake Sullivan realized they'd found the real treasure that Uncle Walter's lottery ticket had been pointing toward all along. Not $47 million, but the knowledge that ordinary people could create extraordinary grace when they committed themselves to serving something larger than their own happiness. The curse was broken. The healing was just beginning. 25 years after Jake Sullivan first offered to help a stranger with her packages, Millbrook, Texas, had become something no one could have imagined, a pilgrimage destination for families seeking hope. The transformation was complete but continuing. What had begun as one woman's struggle against community prejudice had evolved into a comprehensive model for how small towns could become sanctuaries of healing and support. The Millbrook Children's Family Support Center now served over 300 families annually, with a waiting list that stretched months into the future, and partnerships with pediatric hospitals across the Southwest. But the most profound changes were invisible to casual observers, woven into the daily rhythms of a community that had learned to organize itself around caring for others. Emma Sullivan Chen, now 32 and carrying her husband David's surname alongside her own, had returned to Millbrook after completing her doctorate in medical social work at Johns Hopkins. She brought with her innovations in family crisis intervention that built upon everything her parents had created while pushing the boundaries of what comprehensive support could accomplish. Emma's marriage to David Chen, a pediatric surgeon she'd met during her graduate studies, had created another layer of medical expertise within the Sullivan family legacy. But more importantly, it demonstrated that the next generation could build upon their parents' work without being constrained by it. David had chosen to relocate his practice to Texas specifically to contribute to the center's mission, bringing cutting-edge surgical techniques to a rural setting that had never expected to attract top-tier medical talent. Their decision to raise their own children in Millbrook, 3-year-old twins Robert and Sarah, represented a vote of confidence in the community's continued evolution. The twins were growing up in a place where helping families in crisis was as natural as breathing, where medical equipment and art supplies occupied the same spaces, where children facing life-threatening illnesses played alongside healthy kids without anyone thinking twice about the arrangement. Jake, now 63, had stepped back from day-to-day operations of both the ranch and the foundation to focus on what he called strategic grandparenting, a role that involved equal parts childcare, community mentoring, and long-term planning for sustainable growth. His weathered hands, which had once struggled to repair drought-damaged fencing, now built playground equipment for the center's outdoor therapy spaces and taught woodworking classes to teenage siblings who needed constructive outlets during their family's medical journeys. Cassandra, at 59, had become something unprecedented in rural healthcare, a nationally recognized expert in psychosocial oncology who worked primarily with children and families. Her insights into isolation, stigma, and community healing had been incorporated into treatment protocols at major medical centers. But she'd never left Millbrook for more than a few weeks at a time. The town had become her laboratory, her sanctuary, and her life's work all at once. The morning that would change everything, one final time, began like any other Tuesday in September. Cassandra was reviewing applications for the center's expanded sibling support program when her assistant knocked on her office door with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Sullivan, there's someone here to see you. She says it's about your original story. Something about a documentary project that could help other communities understand what you've accomplished." The visitor was Dr. Amara Williams, a filmmaker and social psychologist from UCLA who specialized in documenting community transformation initiatives. But unlike previous researchers and media professionals who'd sought to study Millbrook's evolution, Dr. Williams had a proposal that would require the entire community to confront its history in ways they'd never attempted. "I want to create a comprehensive documentary that follows the full arc of your story," Dr. Williams explained during her meeting with Jake, Cassandra, and Emma. "Not just the success you've achieved, but the painful process of getting here. I want to interview the people who participated in the original ostracism, document how they've changed, and show other communities that transformation is possible even after causing significant harm." The proposal was ambitious and potentially uncomfortable. It would require long-time Millbrook residents to speak honestly about their past behavior, their motivations for excluding Cassandra, and their journey toward becoming a community that embraced radical inclusion. It would mean revisiting painful memories and acknowledging collective responsibility for years of psychological harm. Most challenging, it would require confronting the three men whose lives had been destroyed during Cassandra's previous engagements. Marcus Chen, David Porter, and Thomas Reeves. Dr. Williams wanted to include their perspectives in the documentary to show the full cost of community prejudice and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. "I've been in contact with all three gentlemen," Dr. Williams continued. "They're willing to participate, but only if the community takes full responsibility for what happened and demonstrates genuine commitment to preventing similar harm in the future." The prospect of facing Marcus, David, and Thomas after 25 years filled Cassandra with emotions she'd thought she'd resolved decades earlier. These men had loved her, had tried to build lives with her, and had been systematically destroyed by forces they'd never understood. Her transformation from cursed bride to community healer felt hollow when measured against the suffering they'd endured. Jake saw the pain in his wife's eyes and understood that this documentary represented more than just another opportunity to share their story. It was a chance for true reconciliation, not just between Cassandra and the community that had excluded her, but between that community and the innocent victims of their collective fear. Emma's perspective, shaped by her professional training in trauma recovery and family healing, provided crucial insight into the psychological significance of Dr. Williams's proposal. Healing isn't complete until everyone affected has had a chance to be heard and acknowledged, she told her parents. "Mom, you've forgiven this community and built something beautiful here. But Marcus, David, and Thomas never had that opportunity. They were just expected to disappear and get over it." The decision to participate in the documentary required months of community discussions, town hall meetings, and individual conversations with residents who would need to publicly acknowledge their role in past events. The process was uncomfortable, but ultimately cathartic, forcing Millbrook to grapple with aspects of its history that success and good intentions hadn't erased. Bill Hawkins, now 82 and one of the few remaining residents who remembered Cassandra's childhood, agreed to serve as the community's primary spokesperson for the historical sections of the documentary. His willingness to acknowledge his role in warning Jake away from Cassandra and his evolution into one of the center's most dedicated supporters provided a template for how others could honestly discuss their past behavior. "I was scared," Bill admitted during one of his on-camera interviews. "Scared of change, scared of being wrong about something I'd believed for years, scared of what it would mean if everything we'd told ourselves about Cassandra wasn't true. So I did what scared people do. I tried to make someone else responsible for my fear." The filming process brought Marcus, David, and Thomas back to Millbrook for the first time since their relationship with Cassandra had ended in disaster. Their return was carefully orchestrated to provide maximum support and minimum publicity, allowing them to share their stories without becoming spectacles for community curiosity. Marcus Chen, now 57 and a successful environmental lawyer, in Arizona, had never married. His experience in Millbrook had left him wary of small communities and suspicious of collective narratives about belonging and exclusion. But he'd followed the town's transformation through news coverage and academic publications, and he'd gradually come to understand that his personal tragedy had contributed to preventing others. "What happened to me was devastating," Marcus said during his interview in the center's quiet conference room. "I lost my career, my savings, my faith in human decency. But seeing what this community became afterward, seeing how they learned to care for vulnerable people instead of driving them away, that gives my suffering some meaning." David Porter had rebuilt his life as a freelance educational consultant, working with schools across the Pacific Northwest to develop inclusive curricula and anti-bullying programs. His forced departure from teaching had ultimately led him to work that reached thousands of students rather than just one classroom, but the transition had been brutal and lonely. The hardest part wasn't losing my job or even losing custody of my daughter, David reflected. It was losing faith in the possibility that good intentions could overcome systemic problems. It took me years to believe again that communities could choose to be better than their worst impulses. Thomas Reeves had perhaps traveled the furthest emotional distance since leaving Millbrook. His new bookstore in Oregon had become a community gathering place that hosted reading groups, writing workshops, and cultural events for marginalized populations. His experience with community-driven persecution had transformed him into an advocate for social justice and inclusive spaces. "I don't forgive easily," Thomas said with characteristic honesty, "but I've learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't matter. It's about refusing to let other people's failures define your own capacity for hope." The most powerful moment in the documentary came when Marcus, David, and Thomas met with current center families to discuss resilience, community support, and the difference between destructive and constructive responses to fear. The conversation, facilitated by Emma and Dr. Williams, became an impromptu masterclass in how communities could learn from their mistakes without minimizing the harm they'd caused. "Your town destroyed our lives," Thomas told a group of local leaders with matter-of-fact directness. "But you've also created something here that prevents other people from experiencing what we went through. That doesn't erase our suffering, but it does give it purpose." The documentary, titled "The Cursed Bride: A Community's Journey from Fear to Healing," premiered at the Sundance Film Festival 18 months later. But its real impact came through community screenings in small towns across America, where local leaders watched Millbrook's transformation and began asking whether their own communities might be capable of similar evolution. The film sparked a national conversation about rural resilience, community responsibility, and the possibility of healing even the deepest social wounds. It also generated funding requests from dozens of communities that wanted to develop their own versions of comprehensive family support systems, but perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. A letter from Robert Whitmore Jr., Cassandra's cousin who'd grown up in Millbrook before moving to California for college and never returning. "I always wondered what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to defend you when we were kids," Robert wrote. "Watching the documentary made me realize that it's never too late to stand up for what's right. I'm moving back to Texas to help with the center's expansion. My daughter starts high school next year, and I want her to grow up in a place where helping others isn't just talked about, it's how the community defines itself." Robert's return represented something Cassandra had never expected to experience: the homecoming of family members who'd been lost to the shame and stigma that had once surrounded her name. His teenage daughter Jennifer brought fresh energy to the center's youth programs, and his business expertise proved invaluable as they planned expansion to serve additional rural counties. The documentary's success led to policy changes at state and federal levels, with new funding streams created specifically for rural family support centers, modeled on Millbrook's approach. The Sullivan family found themselves testifying before congressional committees, consulting with the Department of Health and Human Services, and advising international organizations about community-based healthcare delivery. But the work that mattered most continued happening in the renovated buildings on Main Street, where families facing medical crises found not just practical support, but genuine community care that helped them maintain hope during impossible circumstances. As Jake and Cassandra celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by 4 generations of family and friends in the center's garden, they reflected on a journey that had transformed them from isolated individuals into architects of radical compassion. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't won the lottery?" Jake asked during their traditional evening conversation on the porch. "I think we would have found another way," Cassandra replied, watching their grandchildren play with other children whose families the center had served. The money helped, but it wasn't what changed everything. What changed everything was deciding that we could be different from what people expected. Emma, now preparing to take over leadership of the center as her parents gradually transitioned to advisory roles, had her own theory about the lottery's significance in their story. "The lottery wasn't the miracle," she said during the anniversary celebration. "The miracle was that 2 people refused to accept that love had to be limited by other people's fears. Everything else, the money, the recognition, the center, even breaking the curse, was just what happened when they committed to building something better than what they'd inherited." As the sun set over Millbrook on their anniversary evening, Jake and Cassandra sat surrounded by the sound of children playing, families sharing meals, and community members working together to maintain a place where hope had learned to flourish. Even in the darkest circumstances, the woman who'd once been called the cursed bride had become something far more powerful. Proof that love, properly applied and persistently practiced, could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The rancher who'd married her had discovered that the greatest lottery prize wasn't money, but the privilege of building a legacy measured in lives healed, families supported, and futures made possible. In Millbrook, Texas, the curse had been broken so completely that people had forgotten it ever existed. In its place stood something unprecedented, a small town that had learned to organize itself around the radical proposition that every person deserved comprehensive care during their most vulnerable moments. The story of the cursed bride was over. The story of what communities could become when they chose love over fear was just beginning, spreading one family, one town, one act of impossible kindness at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.